Hey everyone, and welcome to our Glad You Asked session for today. And today is a big one. It is probably one of the biggest questions that are asked by Christians and also non-Christians that really cause them to doubt whether God even exists. All right, so just to kind of introduce this topic, when my wife Bianca and I were newly married, we were installing this big heavy shelf table in one of our rooms, and it was a bit of an awkward small space, and we're both holding the one side of the table, and just something caused it to fall, and as it fell down it scraped my head, and I don't think you can really see, but I got quite a scar from the day. But I remember in the moment I just felt pain, and because I felt pain I wanted to blame somebody. Luckily, I had the presence of mind not to blame Bianca or even myself. It's just honestly one of those things that happened. But in the anger, in the pain, I wanted to blame someone. I wanted to lash out at somebody. And so here is the big question for today. Why does God allow so much pain and suffering? And as I mentioned to you earlier, this is one of the toughest questions. All you need to do is switch on the news and just see what's happening in your nation, what's happening around the world. Just try and imagine all the people impacted by all the news that you just read. But it's not only stuff that's happening out there to other people. You just need to look in your own life and just those experiences of pain and suffering. Sometimes it is physical pain or emotional pain or loss or grief or both. And I can guarantee you that in those moments, you are looking up to God saying, at some point, is this pain evidence that you don't exist? Because I can't reconcile a good God with what I'm going through right now. Now, for full disclosure, some of you know that I wrote a book recently this year called The Reason for Everything, where I try and tackle some of these questions. And so today is going to be like a fly through my chapter on evil and suffering. The chapter is called Why is the World So Messed Up? We need to be able to discuss that question. But at the heart of this question is, how can a good God, because we as Christians, we would say God is good, God is loving. And so if there is a good and a loving God, how can he allow me or my neighbor or my family or people around the world to go through such unimaginable pain and suffering? Now, from the outset, here's what makes this question so difficult to talk about. There is a rational, philosophical, and intellectual way of talking about this, and we're definitely going to be going there. But at the heart of it, what makes us so upset about my experience of pain and the existence of God is not primarily the intellectual challenges that I have with that, but the emotional challenges that I have with that. When I sympathize with people who have experienced genocide or just some of the pain that I've gone through, when I say, how could this God allow blank to happen? And as I fill in that blank, I am affected primarily emotionally. And so I just want to recognize and maybe ask you to recognize from the outset that while we are going to try and have a rational, philosophical part of this discussion, at the same time, we are going to be just recognizing some of the incredible pain and emotion that are possibly going to stop us or prevent us from actually being able to deal with this question. So here's how skeptics have tended to phrase the arguments. And this is what they say. They would say, number one, there is so much suffering and pain in this world. Number two, they would say, God is supposed to be good and powerful. Number three, a good and powerful God would not allow so much pain and suffering. Therefore, a good and a powerful God does not exist. So here's the thing. Their first point is there is so much suffering, and pain in this world. And so my first question is, how do we know that? Or how do we even get to call this evil or this experience pain or evil or suffering? All right. So as we look at their argument, here's the thing. They're assuming that we have a valid way of calling our experience of pain and suffering, or kind of evaluating it as a morally negative thing. They're assuming that this is evil. And so my question is, where does that come from? Why are we all assuming that this thing is rightly unfair? And where do we get that from? So I've got 2 young kids, and from the youngest of age, this kid would get something that this kid thought was unfair, or this kid was spending more time playing with this toy than that toy. And even from the youngest age, they haven't studied philosophy, they haven't experienced the great pain and suffering in this world, but intuitively they know that this is unfair. And so where did that sense of unfairness come from? The minute we assume something is unfair, the minute we say that pain and suffering is unfair or it is morally wrong, we are assuming what C.S. Lewis calls a sense of ought. In other words, here is the way the world is, full of pain and suffering, and we're calling it evil. But by calling it evil, we're saying it is wrong. And therefore, we are inherently saying that something is supposed to be right. We are appealing to what things should be. We are appealing to a sense of morality. I'm not just saying I don't like evil. I'm not just saying I don't like it. Just like I don't like rum and raisin ice cream. It's just a matter of preference. If you like it, whatever floats your boat, that's okay. I'm not saying that when I say I don't think that genocide is a good thing. All right, I'm appealing to something beyond me, a sense of morality that I'm calling all of you to recognize that this truly is evil and wrong. And so here's a very important question for you. Do you have a worldview that even allows you to categorize what we experience as pain and suffering as evil or as morally wrong? Now, in the world that I live in, most of the skeptics that are coming to this question are not coming from a Hindu or a Buddhist perspective. They tend to be coming from a naturalistic perspective, from an atheistic or at least an agnostic perspective. And so my question is, from a purely naturalistic perspective, does your worldview allow you to denounce these things as morally wrong or morally evil? You see, the reality is, coming from the naturalistic perspective, and by the way, what I'm about to say, most atheists, at least kind of published scholarly atheists, would agree with me, that what we see in nature is no different to what we should expect in ourselves. We see pain and suffering in the wild. Therefore, when we see pain and suffering in the human race and our cultures, there's nothing that allows me to separate a lion from killing an impala, from a guy killing another guy. Maybe I can say I don't like it, but I'm not allowed to morally call that wrong or evil. I mean, for example, I already referred to kind of predators killing their prey. We see such strange things. We see ground squirrels eating their young. We don't call that morally wrong. We call that nature. We film that and we talk about it and we watch it on documentaries. There's a certain kind of a fish called a cichlid, and they eat each other's eyes. But yet, for some reason, when we see humans doing those kinds of things to one another, we are absolutely horrified. But I would argue that the naturalistic worldview cannot separate human behavior from this behavior, and therefore has no reason to call this morally evil or morally wrong. I also want to talk about our experience of death. Now, I'm a pastor, and I've done over the years of my ministry, I've done many, many funerals. I've done everything from people in their 90s who live just wonderful, righteous lives, all the way right down to newborns. And even I've done a funeral for a preborn loss. And so everything in between. And when I do a funeral, there's always going to be a mix of people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God. And without trying to be insensitive, I'm always intrigued by, especially those who don't believe in God, how they experience death and how they kind of talk about the death. And so on one hand, every single person, people who describe themselves as religious, as Christian, as non-religious, they are, and I would believe rightly, they are rightly experiencing death as a loss, as something that shouldn't be, as if something in me fundamentally believes that death is wrong, and that something in me believes that life should go on. And that is why even non-religious people say things that I don't believe they actually believe, but, she's in a better place. But in the classroom, they'd be arguing that there's no such thing as a better place. There's no such thing as a God. There's no such thing as life after death. Death is the absolute end. And so I just am curious about our experience of death, not what we say in the classroom. But why is it that regardless of what we believe in the classroom, we experience death as loss? We experience death as if something has been stolen from us, and something deep within me fundamentally wants to believe that there is life after death. And once again, my question is, where does that come from? And so for those of you who don't know C.S. Lewis was an Oxford English scholar. He started out as an atheist, an incredible giant of an intellectual. And once he became a Christian, this is one of the things that he said about this whole line of inquiry. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust." But then he realized, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In other words, for me to call anything wrong or evil, including what I agree with you, just the incredible amounts of pain and suffering out there, I am actually required to have an objective sense of morality. Something is right and something is wrong. If I don't have that morality, I am actually unable to even call these most unfathomable pains evil or wrong. All right, now here's something else that we need to think about. Often when we think about pain and evil and suffering, it is suffering that happens out there. Or if we think about evil people, it is evil people out there. It is criminals out there. It is genocidal maniacs out there or in the history books. But if we're going to get honest and real, we have to recognize that there's also something wrong with me. All right, so not only is there evil in the heart of someone like an Adolf Hitler or an Idi Amin, but at some level, there's something wrong with me that I somehow cannot sort out on my own. I mean, speaking for myself, I know that there are people in this world who probably think that they would have less pain in their lives if it wasn't for me. I know that in many ways I am my own worst enemy. When I look at my failures and my moral failures and my weaknesses and my brokenness and my fragility and my incapacity and my moods, I am the one who seems to always stop myself from moving on and growing. In addition, I'm a father and I'm a husband and I'm involved in a community. And as a result, I have hurt my wife. I have hurt my kids. I have hurt people around me. And even when I am truly sorry and there are certain things that I'm like, I will never do that again, something in me somehow flares up. So once again, the evil is not always out there. There's something in me. And so some of you are saying, listen, Stephen, but nobody's perfect. And that is precisely my point. Nobody is perfect. There is a British pastor and a theologian. His name is Andrew Wilson, and he wrote an incredible book called If God, Then What? If you want to go find that, you are really going to enjoy reading that book. But in it, he kind of proposes this hypothesis where he says, imagine you were God for a day. And so you said, listen, I'm going to do what I think God should have done. And that is, I want to reduce the evil and the suffering in this world. So I'm going to look at all the really, really evil people in this world, and then I'm going to get rid of them. And so you start right at the top, and you start with the genocidal maniacs, and you start with the sex traffickers and the drug traffickers. And so you eliminate those people from the world, and then you allow life to carry on for a while. And then you suddenly realize, yes, I've eliminated some evil, but there is still pain, there is still suffering. Some people have just filled in the gap. Okay, so now let's get rid of the next layer of really evil people. So kind of people on death row, really bad criminals, murderers, adulterers, or whatever you classify as what kind of the next level of really bad people are. So you get rid of them and you let life continue for a while, and then you once again realize families are still breaking up. Some other people have still filled the void. It's kind of like that game of whack-a-mole. I deal with this evil, and some more evil seems to pop up somewhere else. As you go through these layers of eliminating the most evil people on planet Earth, realizing that there's still pain and suffering and difficulty in this world, eventually you will be in the next layer of the most evil people in the world. Once again, not only is evil out there, there's evil in me, and I have to, in order to fully engage this discussion, I have to realize just the role that I play in this world as well. So let's recap. There are some very real problems out there. The first problem we looked at was just the very real pain and suffering in the world. The second big problem that we looked at was the problem of death. Up to now, no one has been able to reverse death. Us as humans are incapable of dealing with death. And then the third level of evil and suffering that we looked at was simply that at some level, I am part of the problem, and once again, humans up to now are incapable of actually eliminating these things and doing anything about it. So, where do we go from here? Well, I want to propose that the Christian worldview is the only worldview that not only allows us to describe the world as we see it, including our experience of death and the what we would call sin and failures within myself, but it also taps into what we truly want and what we truly hope this world to be. So let me explain how we get there. First and foremost, Christianity just very clearly describes reality as it is. It is very honest to say that there is pain and evil and suffering in this world. In fact, right from page 1 of Scripture, we see this world being described in fallen and broken and sinful and painful ways. The book of Romans chapter 8 describes it in this way. Paul says, and he's the one who wrote this, he says, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth." For those of you who have been through childbirth, you know how painful that is. As in the pains of childbirth, right up to this present time. Now, this almost makes me want to laugh, the fact that it is so difficult to find a worldview that even allows us to define pain and evil and suffering as morally wrong. That gives me permission to experience pain and suffering as evil. I've already explained how the naturalistic worldview doesn't give us the categories to even do that. Darwin said that nature is red in tooth and claw. The violence we see in the natural world should not surprise us when we see it in this world. If anything, death is required to move things along from an evolutionary perspective. Therefore, we should not be surprised or pained by our experience of death. And so that worldview doesn't really permit us to engage our experience of pain and suffering the way that we do experience it. I haven't got a lot of time for this, but even if we look at some of the comparative religions, Buddhism, for example, invites us to see pain and suffering as something that does not exist. The word they use for it is the word Maya, that pain and suffering is simply an illusion. And part of my progression is that I learn to see pain and suffering as something that does not exist. So the pain that you've experienced, you're called to deny even existed. And then when we look at Hinduism and their idea of karma, karma is so much more than simply what goes around comes around. But if someone is experiencing pain and suffering, I am not allowed to intervene in that. They're just experiencing their karmic debt. The reason why they're experiencing their pain and suffering is because of what they did in their previous life, and they need to pay for that in this lifetime. And if I intervene in that, if I interrupt their pain and suffering, if I alleviate their pain and suffering, they're just going to have to pay that debt off at a later time anyway. And so that worldview is inviting you to ignore pain and suffering in others and yourself, and to actually not try and do anything about it. So once again, to find a worldview that simply allows us to engage reality as we experience it is easier said than done, but I believe Christianity gives us exactly that framework. That's the first thought. The second thought is that Christianity does give us an objective moral reality, that we can say, this is wrong. Sex trafficking is wrong. Cancer is wrong. Death is wrong. It's not just I don't like it. It is absolutely morally wrong. Right from the outset, Genesis chapter 2, this is what we read. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. So for those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with this verse, what is going on here is God is giving us the choice to either trust Him and His definition of good and evil, or we are going to be trusting ourselves. And He's predicting both then and with every human being since then that when we trust our own definition of good and evil, we inevitably lead ourselves towards death, both metaphorical, spiritual, and real, right? There are real consequences for me defining good and evil according to my own definitions. And so when we're saying something is wrong, we are appealing to a morality that is above my personal preferences or even cultural preferences. We believe it is wrong, and the biblical worldview enables you to actually do that. But here's a couple of extra quick thoughts in this whole discussion. We often think of pain as something that is negative, and it most certainly is. But I also want to give you another perspective on this, and this is the gift of pain. Dr. Paul Brand is a famous doctor who used to work with lepers and leprosy, and actually used to work in and with leper colonies. And one of the things that leprosy does to you is it prevents you from actually feeling pain. And so ordinarily, if you and I get our hands too close to a fire, for example, or we put our hand on a stove plate that we were unaware was actually on, because we feel the pain, we retract our hands. The pain alerts us that something is wrong. Now we can go and do something about it. But if you don't experience pain, he just tells story after story. Something falls in the fire. A kid sticks their hand in the fire, doesn't feel the pain, pulls their hand out, and as a result, just experiences such damage. He tells one story about a kid who was trying to turn a key in a lock. He couldn't do it, so this kid just turned the key in a second, and he thought, how on earth did you do that? What he only saw later was this kid's finger in the process broke in half. And so when you and I are experiencing pain, be it the pain from a hot plate or the pain of life, it is a gift to us in the following way. It is alerting us to the fact that there is something wrong, that your intuitions are actually correct, that you are longing for a different kind of world. Another thought I want to leave with you is this idea that when God created us, one of the gifts he gave us was the gift of free will. And in order for us to have free will, we need to have a very real choice. If there was no option aside from choosing God and doing his will and his will alone, we would be robots. And I would argue that if that was the world we lived in, there would be no such thing as love. Because in order for me to love someone and to choose someone, I need to have the freedom to not love them, and therefore to not choose them. And therefore, with this gift called free will, many people, including you and me, regularly abuse that free will, and we choose to hurt ourselves or we choose to hurt people around us. However, in the absence of that, we don't have what I believe is the greatest ethic and the greatest gift that God has given us. And that is the gift of love, both our ability to know and love God and our ability to know and love one another. And so, as we get to the end of this video, is God up in heaven, kind of helplessly watching humans choose bad and evil time and time again, hurting one another, and he's kind of got his hands tied behind his back? Well, I can't do anything about it. Is that how God is relating to us? Well, listen to how God chose to engage with our pain and our evil and our suffering. And just broadly speaking, in the Christian worldview, we would call all of that sin. Not only the sins of people, but that we live in this broken and this fallen creation. And this is how God's response is described. God made him, this is speaking of the Father and the Son, Jesus Christ. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. In other words, Jesus Christ, different to you and me, he lived the perfectly righteous life, both in thought and in motive and in deed. He was the one who, of all people who have ever lived, is perfectly righteous and therefore did not deserve the pain and the evil and the suffering that he endured. But by climbing onto a cross, he took upon himself the full experience of the human condition, the full sense of injustice that you and I experience, as well as the full wrath of God against that. And what I mean by that is, God is not like this drunken father who's just beating up humanity or beating up his son. But God feels about evil the exact same way you feel about evil. You are angry about pain. You are angry about suffering. And therefore God is angry about pain and suffering. And so Jesus became the one who experienced that in full for us. And so Timothy Keller, a New York pastor, apologist and theologian, he says, while this doesn't necessarily explain every one of our questions with regards to pain and suffering, this is what he says. He says, we now know what the answer isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us. It can't be that he is indifferent or detached from our condition. God takes our misery and suffering so seriously that he was willing to take it on himself. But now the story of the cross doesn't end with the death of Jesus, but it continues with the resurrection of Jesus, where Jesus literally defeated death. The one and only human being who defeated death, and didn't defeat death only to die again, like some form of kind of miraculous resuscitation. But Jesus rose from the dead never to die again. He is still the resurrected one. Earlier, I spoke about the fact that regardless of whether you're religious or irreligious, there is something in us, and we see this especially at funerals. There's something in us that believes that death should not be. And I would argue that those intuitions are correct. That somehow I believe that this person's life should go on, that my life should go on. I would argue once again that your intuitions are correct. But the only way that we can have hope that that is true is in the resurrection of Jesus. That by dying, Jesus experienced the death that you and I experience. But by rising from the dead, he beats death. And when we are in him and when we trust what he did, and he alone did, by the way, this is the only worldview that gives us this, that we can have a very real hope that we will experience eternal life. And the scriptures define this eternal future in the following way. Revelation 21 verses 4, that says, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And so we actually believe. We don't just say these things to one another to make each other feel better, but we don't really believe these things. We actually believe that the resurrection of Jesus means that we can count on this eternal future, that there will come a time where everything about this world that I hate will cease to exist, and everything about this world that I love will be just a foretaste of a much greater reality, and that we experience in and through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, once again, I acknowledge that this isn't simply an intellectual discussion, and maybe as you've heard this video, I have no idea what you've experienced. I have no idea the pain and suffering that you've been through or maybe are currently going through. But regardless of the emotion of that, I do want to appeal to you to think about the kinds of things we've spoken about and invite you to consider the Christian worldview and how I believe not only is it the best explanation of our experience of this world, but also of our hopes for a better world. So guys, if this video has been helpful to you in any way, please won't you share it, please won't you like it, please won't you subscribe. There are so many people who are needing to engage this discussion in a more thoughtful way, and so you can be part of that by doing that. Thank you everyone, and God bless you this week.